The Denver Broncos inside linebacker position could look entirely different in 2025, especially after they moved on from one of the position coaches there. How might Sean Payton of the Broncos address the offseason? We'll break that down and much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it is your team every single day, even in the offseason. Because for the true fan, there's never an offseason for all the Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more that you can't get anywhere else. We got you covered here, Locked On Broncos. Thanks to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. I'm Cody Roark, credentialed Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, longtime site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com. We got a lot to break down as we continue our position overview series here following the conclusion of the Broncos season. We've already done all the offensive positions, so if you missed that, make sure you go check out Locked On Broncos wherever you get your podcast for all the insight into every offensive position possible. We begin defense here today by taking a look at inside linebacker. We'll wrap up the show by maybe looking at some of the moves the Broncos could make in NFL free agency if they go that route. We'll also take a look and answer maybe the biggest question of the offseason. Will Alex Singleton return to Denver this season? But we're also going to recap what was 2024. Some injuries, some new opportunities. The Broncos inside linebacker group had a lot of body of work on tape. And it's going to lead to a lot of questions here this offseason. So with that said, Sayre, let's all break it down, my friend. 2024, I tell you what, I think at the beginning of the season, right, week one against the Seattle Seahawks, I felt like we were sitting here and there was a level of comfortability with, oh, hey, Cody Barton and Alex Singleton, they're actually playing pretty well. I mean, the first play of the entire season for the Broncos, what was it? Jonathan Cooper gets a sack. The second play of the season for the Broncos defense, Alex Singleton gets an interception in week one. And little did we know in week three, Alex Singleton's season would end because he tore his ACL, played the entire game on it, and then found out afterwards that it was torn and then missed the remainder of the season. From that point forward, the Broncos inside linebacker position, I thought it had bright spots, but overall it ended up costing them at the end of the season.
Yeah, it really did. I think the Broncos clearly missed Alex Singleton's instincts and consistency out there over the course of the year. And it felt like a bad injury at the time. And then we saw the team kind of bounce back right away, like that game against New Orleans, where I think just about everybody that played made a play, right? I mean, it was Cody Barton had a defensive touchdown, should have had multiple in that game. Justin Strnad made plays. Quan Alexander, who wasn't even on the team at the end of the year, ended up making a play. So it was kind of all over the map in terms of who stepped up and when, and it just wasn't consistent enough, even from the guys who produced. And you go back to that week one game, Cody, I found it interesting to think back because I'm pretty positive that Christian Welch, the guy that they had picked up from the Packers off the waiver wire, I'm pretty sure he subbed in for Cody Barton at one point during that game. And at that time, like the Broncos, I don't even know if they were certain that Cody was going to be the full-time starter at that spot because Welch played quite a bit in that particular game. And then they moved on and, it was kind of just this revolving door. We saw Zach Cunningham signed to the 53-man roster. He didn't really play much. We saw Lavelle Bailey signed to the 53-man roster. He played mostly special teams. And so it's left more questions than anything, certainly answers when it comes to this position group going forward, which I know we're going to discuss, but it was just too much of a mixed bag in 2024, in my opinion, when you talk about needing consistent production at the off-ball linebacker, especially when you have such a good defensive line.
Yeah, and obviously in yesterday's episode of the Locked On Broncos, as we talked about, Denver did make the decision to fire inside linebacker coach Greg Manusky. So for them, it tells you Sean Payton was not very pleased with the production or the consistency of that group and also the coaching aspect of it because, hey, a lot of these players, they're doing what they're coached to do. And to the standard, if the Broncos position group at linebacker struggled, that also means that the coaching aspect at that position also struggled and was not good enough in the eyes of Payton. And so we'll see who they decide to bring in to replace him. But, I mean, I agree with you, too. And then Denver made the decision. I think this was more – I don't know if this was Sean Payton, Vance Joseph, or if this was front office decision. But then you move Drew Sanders back from outside linebacker to off-ball linebacker. And against the Chargers, he plays, one snap? He gets a sack on that one snap there. Sean Payton has coined him as a pressure player. And now we've got it in our head like, okay, right now, when you look at this linebacker group, there's only 3 guys that, at least right now, as we're doing this, that are under contract going into 2025. 3 of those guys that you mentioned, Strnad, Cody Barton, Zach Cunningham, they're unrestricted free agents. I think Denver's going to go in a different direction, and maybe that room is going to look entirely different this upcoming season. But, I mean, to your point, Sarah, what ended up happening with this position? Often at times, and from what I understand, there were some miscommunication issues between the linebackers and the safeties. And then, of course, everyone's trying to figure out who to blame. There were times where just Denver, they had a guy in the wrong position, or one guy didn't do his responsibility. One guy is not supposed to blitz, but he blitzes. And then it leads to, obviously, a hole in coverage. Like, those were things of that nature that did occur for the Broncos throughout the season, especially towards the end here. And so it makes everybody look bad, right? I do think, in my opinion, right, I think Justin Strnad brings value to this team. Now, is he going to be a starter for you, Sayre? Probably not. I don't think so. But I thought, like, if you need him to start, you're going to get solid play from him. Of course, he had some of his struggles toward the end of the season. And I think Broncos fans sometimes can look at some of the struggles and be like, why is he even on this roster? You got to let players struggle. But as we know, there were some other issues going on that weren't necessarily Strnad's fault, or weren't necessarily at times PJ Locke or Brandon Jones' fault. Like, there's plenty of blame to go around here. It doesn't mean that they're terrible players. I think Strnad brings tremendous value to the Broncos as a core 4 special teams guy. The moment Alex Singleton got injured, Strnad had to get taken off of special teams primarily, and then he had to jump into a larger, more featured role, where I felt like he was probably the more consistent inside linebacker that the Broncos had this season versus, other guys there. And so I'm not saying bring him back to start, but I think you bring Justin Strnad back to continue to be one of your core 4 special teams guys. I don't know what his market's going to be like. I know it's going to drive up some interest, though, compared to what it was last year when he almost signed with the Carolina Panthers.
And we saw Vance Joseph put him, a trial by fire, right? Justin Strnad was not expected to be a starter on this defense in 2020. The fact that we talked about it, Christian Welch was playing in week 1 is indicative of the fact that they did not plan on Strnad playing in the defense this season. There's just no question about it. Injuries forced the issue there, but he ended up getting thrown to the fire, Cody. I'm looking at the Broncos' advanced stats from Pro Football Reference this past season. Justin Strnad was sent on 42 blitzes, and that was second behind just Cody Barton in terms of the off-ball linebackers. I don't know how they necessarily quantify Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, and Jonah Ellis, who are the other guys in the top 5 there. I don't know how often those guys blitz as opposed to just, their pass rushers off the edge. So, Cody Barton, he led the team in off-ball linebacker blitzes, but Justin Strnad was not far behind, and he obviously played a significantly smaller chunk of the snaps this past season. And so I felt like that was one of the ways the Broncos kind of tried to maybe mask a little bit the fact that he hadn't had much time on task. Like, let's send him after the quarterback and see if he can go make a play, because he's got the athleticism, he's got the aggressiveness. And I think Strnad probably made the biggest splash plays. I know Cody Barton had some big ones, but I feel like Strnad made the biggest splash plays in terms of rushing the passer, tackles for loss, things like that. So it's kind of indicative of the position group as a whole, in my opinion, that I think Strnad probably was the best guy out there in terms of per snap basis. He was the most effective.
Yeah, I think if you're going to bring any of those 3 unrestricted guys back, Strnad would be the one that I would choose to bring back because of special teams. And if you need him to step into a starting role, I think he can do a serviceable job. We'll see what it looks like with new coaching, though. Like, that's obviously another element that could factor into the decision, especially for a position coach. Ultimately, Sean Payton's like, we know what personnel we want. That position coach is going to have some say in who he believes can help the defense win games this upcoming season. So that's also a little bit of an unknown factor at this point as we continue to go through it. But really that kind of leads us into our next point on today's episode of the show, Broncos Country. What are some of the biggest questions surrounding the inside linebacker position? Well, one of them being, will Alex Singleton return this season? We'll take a look at some of the possibilities here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at TurboTax. And this is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. And then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with the TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, file every investment, and everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed, no waiting, no wondering, and no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
Among the number of big questions at inside linebacker for the Denver Broncos in 2025, the biggest perhaps, will Alex Singleton be coming back? Broncos Country, we're going to talk about that as well as some other major questions for off-ball linebacker, the middle linebacker position, and key position on this Denver defense going forward in an area that could be a huge area of emphasis in the offseason. Broncos Country, thanks so much for making Cody and I here at Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You know that we got you covered whatever happens with the Denver Broncos, as well as just breaking down all of the aspects of this roster, kind of trying to do our part as the armchair general managers this offseason. So join us in the fun. If you haven't already done so, make us part of your day every single day. Hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and on YouTube. Cody, let's ask the big question. I'm just going to throw it out there. Does Alex Singleton come back to this Denver Broncos team in 2025? With the qualifier, he is under contract. He's not a pending free agent. He is under contract, but obviously coming off the ACL injury. Do you think he comes back and as a captain of the team, right? Somebody that's really well-liked on this roster. Do you feel like he's going to be back and starting in 2025?
I would be shocked if he's not, to be honest with you. I think Singleton will probably be the one guy who does return. But then again, I mean, Sayre, there are no guarantees. I mean, every need that this team has, and arguably inside linebacker is one of their biggest needs defensively when you look at it on paper. And so that could look entirely different. Now, you mentioned Singleton is still under contract. I'm using this tool right now over there. Pro Football Network just launched a brand new offseason manager tool where you can kind of be the GM. You can be the team that obviously, you root for on Sundays, but it gives you the options to go through and look at players that you can cut, you can restructure their contract. Right now, I mean, it says that their estimated cap space remaining for the Broncos, according to Pro Football Network's machine here, says $38 million. Alex Singleton here, his cap hit in 2025 is going to be $6.9 million. There's going to be $1.3 million in dead money if you release him, but savings of $5.5 million if you cut him. So if, let's say the Broncos were to cut Alex Singleton, then that means that it bumps their cap space up in this model here to $43 million. However, I think you can approach a restructure with him as well. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but then you can re-sign players, you can tag players. I think for continuity's sake, because of leadership and obviously that, and the fact that this guy, he's everywhere where the football is here. I thought Singleton was off to a really great start this season before he tore his ACL. I think you bring him back. And then I also think you also revamp the position in and of itself, because look at it, Sayre. I mean, with Alex Singleton missing the season, you know who led the team in tackles this year for the Broncos? It wasn't an inside linebacker. It was Brandon Jones, the safety, who turned in a heck of a year. But when your safety is leading your team in tackles, essentially, that also might be problematic, because when you think about it, the linebacker has the best path towards stopping the ball carrier initially. So the fact that Brandon Jones had to come up a lot and clean up some tackles or tackle at the second level, not a good sign on how the linebackers played there ultimately in 2025. So for me, I think Singleton will be back. Where are you at on this? Do you think he'll be back?
I do. I think he's going to come back on a reduced contract, Cody. As you mentioned, the cap hit over $7 million. You can find cap savings there if you cut him. But if you cut him also, I mean, the cap savings are what you said, $5.5 million. It's not like, I mean, you could do some damage with that in free agency. There's no question about it. You could get a good player at that, average annual rate. But is it worth cutting a sure thing in Singleton? And I guess I got to be careful saying a sure thing, because he is coming off the knee injury. So that does kind of complicate the discussion a bit. And that's why I think at a reduced deal, we will see Alex Singleton back this year. And that frees up cap space for the Broncos, but also gives you a potential starter there at one of those spots. Now, when it comes to the question of who do you pair him with, I think that's really interesting, right? Because is it anybody on the roster? As I mentioned in the first segment, Justin Strnad was quite a bit more effective on a per snap basis than was Cody Barton. Cody Barton, over the course of the year, played and started most of the games, played the majority of snaps. He had 2 tackles for loss last year compared to 8 for Justin Strnad, who barely played 50. I think he played 59% of the total snaps. So you're not making a ton of plays at or behind the line of scrimmage if you're Cody Barton. Can the Broncos trust that going forward? I love the idea of bringing Singleton back at a reduced deal. And when the Broncos signed Barton, they said at worst, he's a high-end special teams guy. If you can get him back to do that, I would be on board for that. But I'm not guaranteeing Cody Barton a starting job here in 2025, even if he is re-signed.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point as well. And you look at the roster, you still have Drew Sanders. I think right now, and you and I have talked about this when highlighting some of the things the Broncos can maybe learn from other teams in the playoffs. Can Drew Sanders become your kind of hybrid QB spy? Look, I mean, he bulked up. He added some muscle and some weight to be able to play off the edge at outside linebacker, tore his Achilles, obviously, and then you moved him back to off-ball linebacker. Does he lose some of that? Does he get a little bit faster? Can he be that sideline-to-sideline guy, that QB spy? I certainly think it's possible here for that, but that's also a big ask as well for a guy who's going to be really entering his 3rd season in the NFL and hasn't really had a true sense of like, this is where I'm playing. His first 2 years have been, you're going to play this. No, wait, you're going to switch you in the middle of your rookie season to this position. Okay. In your second year, you're going to play this position. Okay. Well, now we're going to switch you back to that initial position that you came to the NFL with initially. And it's like, that can do so much to impact and hurt a player's development. Sure, it's good. And if he can pick up how to play edge and how to play inside, yeah, he could become a weapon here, but you don't want to throw too much because all those different positions have different rules and responsibilities. So why overload a player? Find where he can best help your team and best get on the field here. That's, I think, the goal here for Drew Sanders. And then Lavelle Bailey, a guy that Sean Payton came out and said, hey, we really like the undrafted guy here out of Fresno State. Certainly was a guy who shined in the NFL preseason for you. What can he do to continue to develop? Is he going to have a premier role here in 2025? I mean, on paper, I wouldn't think that's possible. I don't think he would. But then again, you see players take leaps all the time where and Sean Payton always emphasizes this. It's not about your path. It's not about how you got here. It's about what we do with you now that you're here. And it's about what you do with the opportunity now that you're here. So maybe Lavelle Bailey, you might just be this surprise wild card question mark that we'll kind of keep in the back pocket here throughout the entire offseason. But I think as you look at it right now, Denver's got to look at some of these options in NFL free agency. And obviously, we're going to highlight maybe what some of those moves could be, some of those names as to who they could be here. But really, it's hard to analyze that when we don't know who the linebacker coach is going to be just yet. So that's also going to be something that, maybe we start looking at ties to Vance Joseph. Who was the linebacker coach for Vance Joseph when he was there in Arizona? If anyone's watching or listening, make sure you pop that out because off the top of my head, I can't recall.
No, I can't recall either. So yeah, somebody in the comments hit us up with that because that would be interesting to know. Of course, anybody with ties to Sean Payton, as we mentioned in yesterday's episode, is also going to be worth monitoring. I think my big question here at this position too, Cody, beyond just does Alex Singleton come back, do you have 2 new starters at inside linebacker in 2025? I think that's very much within the realm of possibility. I'd even go so far as to say that might be the preference that I have at this point. Just say, hey, you know what? We're getting a new off-ball linebackers coach. We may have a new defensive coordinator in 2026. Like, let's get new inside linebackers in here now and get these guys going and get them some chemistry. I mean, Drew Sanders being potentially back at the off-ball linebacker spot, it doesn't necessarily complicate the discussion, but I think it enhances the options that you have, right? Because you want to get that guy on the field. He's athletic, he's talented, he's got range, he can rush the passer, he can make plays at and behind the line of scrimmage. That was what made him an All-American at Arkansas. So I think that would be exciting, but also there's so much question there with, do you ride into the regular season with? That's my problem with the whole Alex Singleton discussion, right? Is that he's 31 going on 32 this coming year. He's coming off injury. You could save money by letting him go. You don't necessarily have a sure thing in-house on the roster. That would be my biggest gripe if the Broncos kind of try to maintain status quo and say, hey, we're going to rock with Singleton again this year. We're going to bring up Drew Sanders again. It's not about it being underwhelming, but at the same time, it's like concerning based on we haven't seen these guys at all really over the last year. And certainly in Sanders' case, not at all in the NFL yet.
Well, I got the answer for who was on Vance Joseph's staff in 2019. Really, 2021, 2022. It's Billy Davis, but he's the inside linebacker coach now for the Houston Texans defense. So that's obviously not going to be something that happens because you can't have a lateral movement like that. So I think for Sean Payton, as he always says, his motto is slow to hire. Like he evaluates every possibility, every coach, extensively before making the decision. Is this a good fit here to the locker room? But quick to fire. 2 years of not up to par performance here by the Broncos inside linebacker position, and that has led to a change there. That'll obviously be a big question that we don't have the answer to just yet. We don't know who that answer is going to be as well, but when that happens, you can expect an episode here, Locked On Broncos, to break it down. But when it comes to some potential moves that the Broncos could make to upgrade this position, there are a couple intriguing names in NFL free agency that we'll tell you about here on today's episode of the show. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. But attending the big game, that's a whole nother experience, especially if you were in the New Orleans area. You can get tickets to the big game on Sunday here in just a couple of weeks here. In Game Time, they have a brand new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff and it shows you only the incredible deals that they have on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. You get the best seat, the best vantage point right inside of the Game Time app. On top of that, their seat views feature is incredible. It shows you exactly what the action is going to be like at the field, whether it's, the big game on Sunday, whether you're going to a concert, a local basketball game, if you're going to go see the Denver Nuggets play at Ball Arena, they've got you covered inside of the Game Time app. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. The fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is here. And Denver, they've got to answer the question as to what that linebacker room is going to look like here in 2025. If they look to the free agency market, who are some names that the Broncos could or should be invested in talking to? We'll break all that down here on today's episode of the show. Once again, I want to say thanks to all the everydayers. Thanks to the first listeners in Broncos Country for making the show exactly what it is. However you choose to consume the show, whether you watch it on YouTube or whether you listen wherever you get your podcasts, make sure you listen every single day, Monday through Friday, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team with objective coverage. 30 minutes or less, Locked On Broncos, we got you covered every day here. Let's take a look at some free agency options here, Sayre. Denver's got 3 unrestricted free agents, as we know, Cody Barton, Justin Strnad, and Zach Cunningham. But there are a lot of intriguing names, and there are a lot of names that I think are on Broncos Country's wish list that Denver should go out and go get. In my opinion, we could look at a lot of names, right? What is it, though? If you're going to bring in someone to free agency, what type of linebacker do you need the most here at off ball?
I think you need somebody with some speed, with some range and instincts. I mean, I know those are the top 3 things you're always looking for at the inside linebacker position, but the Broncos just have to raise the floor there. I mean, they need guys that are proven that they can do this. And I think really just adding team speed to that defense, that's a big deal. When you look at what was lacking this year, I think really the coverage out of the backfield, they had a tough time with that a lot throughout the season. I know that every Broncos fan has always complained about, man, this team really can't cover tight ends. I don't think that that's necessarily ever really going to be the case unless it's on an isolated basis, right? Or in the red zone, things like that, where you need guys to cover in a tighter window. I'm looking at guys, Cody, like everybody's talking about Zach Bond. That would be exciting. Obviously, the former Saint. And I'm wondering, why did the Broncos not try to bring him in this past year? I mean, Sean Payton drafted him. Cody Roark was there in the front office. Why didn't they add him this year? I mean, at least in terms of special teams ability, that's what he was known for in New Orleans. Why not bring him in? But I think he's going to be out of the price range. Dre Greenlaw, another guy coming off injury. Is he going to be out of the price range? Because you may need to sign 2 starters here, right? I don't know. I'd be looking at some different guys in this free agent class, like Willie Gay Jr., Nick Bolton. I know those guys are former Chiefs, but those guys intrigue me, Cody, in terms of their athleticism, their ability to play at around the line of scrimmage and to play in coverage.
Yeah, I mean, look, and why not go against, why not bring in someone that's like played against, that played for, the dynasty you're trying to beat. And obviously the Kansas City Chiefs. Those are some interesting names. Obviously, Willie Gay spent time, obviously, more recently with the New Orleans Saints. He's got that familiarity here. There's some veteran names. I know Levante David's out there, but he's going to be 36 next year. No, I don't think anyone wants to do that. Bobby Wagner, despite being 34 years old, is going to be 35 next year. Played relatively well for Washington. I don't think you go that route. And obviously, I don't think you go with Devondre Campbell, who quit on the 49ers this year. I think that's really going to impact his optics overall. But then you look at guys like Denzel Perryman, set to be a free agent, obviously played for the LA Chargers at this point. I look at guys like Devin Bush, who's still 26, going to be 27 years old next year. Maybe that's an option. Devin White played for the Houston Texans, obviously, playing for Vance Joseph's former linebacker coach that he had when he was on staff there in Arizona. There are some names here, but really the top heavy guys, they're really up. When you look at Spot Track, it's the guys who have the previously highest AAV. And right now, those guys that have the highest one, Levante David at $8.5 million, Bobby Wagner, $6.5, Devondre Campbell at $5 million. From that point forward, Willie Gay had a previous AAV of $3 million average annual value. And then all these other guys had 2.3, 2.5 million. This is one, I don't know if you're going to have to go out there and spend massive money, but you can get a quality player here, a capable starter with one of these guys. So, Sayre, out of all these names that I mentioned, right now, and I'll limit it here. Let's say Willie Gay, you look at Denzel Perryman, Devin Bush. Who of those names, or even Devin White as well, let's bring up his name. Who would you look to bring in?
I think out of those names, I'd say Willie Gay and then maybe Devin Bush, because he was the top 10 pick. Remember, the Broncos traded the pick that the Steelers ended up using on him. I think he had a little bit of a bounce back year with the Cleveland Browns this past year. Somebody was asking me recently about my thoughts on Devin Bush, and I was like, well, I didn't really watch too much of Devin Bush this past year, but when you go back and take a look, he had a pretty good season for the Cleveland Browns. And so I like guys like that they stood out in the pre-draft process because of their athletic traits. And I think inside linebacker is one of those position groups where you get caught up in the, like, wow, this guy had a great 40-yard dash. He looks so good coming off the bus, right? He's 6'3", 245. But if you don't have instincts and the game can't slow down for you yet, you're going to be struggling to keep your head above water at the NFL level. If these guys can develop over time in that regard, that's a huge advantage in their favor. And so Devin Bush, maybe it's clicking for him as his career is going on. So I kind of like that idea. Go after somebody who is known for their athleticism, but they're slowly but surely kind of starting to figure out the mental side as well.
Let me ask you this then, right? Okay, if you had the decision here today to be the general manager, knowing that, look, okay, Alex Singleton's coming off the ACL, you have Drew Sanders, but we don't really know who or what he's going to be just yet. Do you sign a starter in free agency? And then also, do you shift your focus on maybe even adding a linebacker in this year's NFL draft as well? Where are you going with that?
Yeah, maybe you do. I think you will have to draft somebody this year if you're the Broncos. Not necessarily, hey, let's go after the Alabama kid in the first round, but at the same time, you're struggling in the depth department at this point, right? You're going to have to add to that room. I know there's a guy from Ole Miss named Chris Paul Jr., Cody, which would be kind of hilarious to see a Chris Paul in the NFL. He's supposedly really good, but the linebacker position now is kind of like what the running back position has been on the offensive side. I mean, it gets devalued in the draft process. It gets devalued in free agency, and you can find tremendous value because of that. And so I think the Broncos need to figure out what's that best combination. If it's going after a couple of free agents, if it's bringing guys back, drafting guys, whatever the case may be, they've got to find the right formula because this position group, it has to be elevated in 2025. No question.
I agree with you entirely. And look, Broncos Country, this is where we want your insight as well. Make sure you interact with the Locked On Broncos community polls on YouTube. You can get involved in the show, even in the comments or on social media. When it comes to inside linebacker, if you were the general manager, how would you attack this position here today, knowing that Alex Singleton's coming off the ACL? You only have two other players under contract. How would you address inside linebacker? Make sure you let us know here on Locked On Broncos. But that'll lead us to our next conversation on tomorrow's episode of the show as we take a look at the outside linebacker position. We'll look at the emergence of Nick Bonito and Jonathan Cooper, and we'll also highlight how that position group can get even better in 2025. Are there any questions surrounding the depth of that position? No, that's going to be an interesting one we'll discuss and debate on tomorrow's episode. Locked On Broncos. We'll see you then.